Good afternoon. Good to have everyone. In early May, I and probably many of you in the room attended a session at the Kansas Department of Agriculture building, kind of rolling out this new program that may provide an opportunity for the state of Kansas to become involved in at least the initial stages of research in industrial hemp. There are quite a few side rails on what we can do, at least initially, and probably going forward for the next several years as well, with regard to this crop. But certainly there's a lot of interest, and I kind of forget whose idea it was. It may have been, I may have to credit Dan Devlin, I'm not really sure. Hey, why don't we have a hemp session? Sounded like a great idea, and so here we are. And so to kick us off today, one of the people that was on this, or participated in this session at KDA back in May was our first speaker, Jeff Vogel, Plant Protection and Weed Control Program Manager. And Jeff, without further ado, your slides are queued up, I think, and ready to go. And there's the slide advancer. And Jeff, if you don't mind, maybe introduce yourself a little bit, if you would, to the group, and then the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm currently the Program Manager of Plant Protection and Weed Control at the Kansas Department of Agriculture, and that program is just kind of where this responsibility is funneled down to in the Department of Ag. Honestly, we of course didn't have an industrial hemp program prior to this year, but now we're kind of trying to work through the process of setting that up. A little bit of background for me: I'm a K-State grad, agronomy graduate. I did a master's degree, got to work with weed science, not this particular. Now we got all those weed jokes out of the way, we can move forward, right? But with that being said, I've been the program manager for plant protection and weed control since 2011, and focused a lot on invasive pests of concern, regulatory work, nursery industry. But this year, the legislature gave us some more responsibility with trying to develop this program in short notice. Of course, a lot of states have done this before us, and so we were able to work with a lot of states' departments of ag and try to figure out what would work for us and what doesn't. But the big difference, though, is the statute or the law that we're working under is different than a lot of states deal with. I'm going to refer it to Senate Bill 263. It actually has a statute under it right now. It's numbered. I'll show that to you in the next couple slides. But Senate Bill 263 set up the framework for us to develop this program. And it has some very rigid restrictions, but then a lot of it was left in the open, which triggered us into a very, I guess, very speedy outreach program to try to get as much input as we can from stakeholders so we can develop this program within the parameters of the bill into something that would work. I think all of us understand this is the first shot in Kansas. This is not perfect. There's limitations here, but it's certainly a little bit more, gives the people a little bit more options than that were there in previous years. So with that, I'll get started here in thinking about Senate Bill 263. In this case, it's KSA's 230. One in the evening, but you know, I do want to point out, though, I know a lot of people talk about industrial hemp as trying to be another commodity, but it's not. It's not like growing corn and beans. This is the first time we have a controlled substance that can be grown as a crop as long as we do a quantitative test in the lab to prove it that a certain chemical is below a certain quantity. And that makes it very difficult because law enforcement looks at that a little bit differently. All of a sudden we start thinking about reasonable suspicion, car searches, what all gets impacted down the line from allowing people to handle industrial hemp. And so that's where we talk about looking at stakeholders and trying to balance everybody's priorities. So that's why we have a lot of restrictions and requirements here, is so that not only do law enforcement feel comfortable, you guys as people who might be handling this also don't accidentally get taken into custody because you're handling a controlled substance. You have all the documentation in place to prevent that from happening. So we'll go through all that here in the next slides, but looking back at the statute, there is a section of definitions. It defines a number of different things. Unfortunately, if they define it wrong in a statute, we can't correct it in regulation. We are dealing with a couple issues, but we've tried to work through that as best we can. But really, Section 2 talks about the meat of it all. And I want to point out here in the first line there is that the department alone or in coordination with universities, and the universities are specifically defined in the bill, and K-State is one of those, but of course the community colleges are not, but K-State, Fort Hays State, Pittsburgh State, there's a handful of other ones, may cultivate industrial hemp from certified seed and promote the research and development of industrial hemp. So this point out one big restriction here is the idea, like in a lot of breeding programs, you're looking at the wild relatives, looking for good genetics to bring into some sort of cultivated variety. That is not allowed here. Everything has to be from certified seed. And I know that's a limitation. That's something people are going to be looking at in the future, but that is certainly the part of the law we're working under right now. We have to create an advisory board. And so if we act alone, meaning that the department does research on our own, we have to have an advisory board in place to approve those applications. So if you do a legal connect the dots, what we're talking about there is this: if we license people, individual growers, distributors, processors, we'll talk about that later, to do industrial hemp research, they are doing that research on behalf of the Department of Agriculture. That is the legal connect the dots that makes this in compliance with the 2014 Farm Bill. The department will oversee all licensed individuals participating in the cultivation, growth, research, oversight, study, analysis, transportation, processing, or distribution. That is about anything you can do with industrial hemp. Honestly, though, we kind of skip over study because we're not going to license anybody that reads a book. I joke about that, but the idea of study, why is that in there? But again, this is the bill. This is what was written. Another big requirement here is that anybody who participates in this, so not only the farmer, but this is a good example for you guys as extension agents, if you are participating in the growth of industrial hemp with a cooperator on his property, there may be some gray area there, you would need to be identified on that application that grower submits and comply with the background check. So anybody who participates has to comply with that background check requirement. We also need to, and I guess really the background check, the only thing we're looking at is violations of drug sorts of felonies. Anything related to that, whether it's state, federal, or another state, that would pop up on our radar and that person couldn't get an individual license. The secretary, meaning us, have to adopt these rules and regulations by December 31st. So they gave us a very strict deadline in getting these done quickly. Normally when we go through this process, it takes about 15 months. We had 6. And I think we're making some progress. We'll get into a little bit about that where we're at later on. But we're certainly trying to get it as close to December 31st as possible. But it is very extensive because it's a brand new program. We're not amending old language. We have 26 pages, single-spaced, of regulations. You think that's pretty crazy, but there is a lot of detail associated with this that makes it possible to have this program that complies with state and federal law. We're allowed to charge fees for this. We have to self-fund this program, and so when we start thinking about fees, we have to have a fee structure that allows us to pay for the program, pay for personnel, pay for the inspection costs. So that is one thing that allows us to do. Unfortunately, regulating it at this point is very expensive because it's new. An example that really drives up the cost is we're not allowed to ship samples through the post office or FedEx. We have to hand carry those samples. And so, of course, if you're hand delivering and moving stuff across the state, that gets very expensive very fast. We look at this slide. It talks about what would research may include? And I'm not going to go through this. This is part of Senate Bill 263. But research includes about anything and everything. Agronomic, economic, any sort of analysis study. I do want to point out is the bill, and it made headlines and it still has in recent months, the idea of pilot programs in Russell County. Well, that originally was part of the bill and really was specifically identified Russell County as a pilot location, but then it was amended to include any other location in Kansas too. So anybody in the state can apply and participate in this program. It's not just Russell County. As we look at the process of developing and adopting regulations, so some of you who were at the May 11th meeting, I may have seen this similar slide. The idea of what we have to go through to get that done. Internally, we have a checklist of things we do as far as develop rules and regs, share them with stakeholders, get that input, fix them, change them, get approval from the secretary, and repeat that as much as possible until we have a final version acceptable. Then we follow the regulatory process, the actual formal process, and we adopt those and then we revise them as necessary. This next slide shows that regulatory process in detail. And I'll point out where we're at right now is we have submitted them to the Division of Budget for their review. We got their stamp. They literally stamp a piece of paper. So if we don't have a piece of paper stamped, it's nothing electronic. It's a physical stamp of that paper. We go to the administration stamps off on it. They are essentially giving us just a very detailed grammar review, nothing legal. And of course, the Attorney General's office gives us a legal review, making sure it complies. So right now, we're at the Attorney General's office. We've actually revised them one time since they saw them the first time, the Attorney General's office, and we're fairly confident they'll stamp off on them very soon. And we can go through the process of actually scheduling a public hearing. The point here is, as we look at this deadline of December 31st, we're already in the middle of October. If we have 61 days minimum between the publishment and the public hearing, that puts us near Christmas time. And then if everything is okay, the secretary signs them, they get republished again, and 15 days later they're effective. And so that puts us in January right now. That's just the reality of where things ended up coming together. But honestly, a lot of time has been put into this, and I feel very good about where we're at in the process. So actually now, what does this program look like looking at our regulations? The May 11th meeting we had a lot of information provided to us by speakers, by the public on what they want this to look like. And then we had a number of advisory board meetings. I say 4 here. We've actually had a few more since then. And this is what we came up with. And so these are kind of the headers of the regulations we look at, the license approval process, the state advisory board, how that's made up, requirements for licenses. So we look at that. We have essentially 5 different licenses: a grower, distributor, processor, administrative license, and state educational institution. So why these different licenses? Well, there's different activities depending on what license you have. So if you're a grower, if you're going to cultivate, plant, grow, or harvest industrial hemp, you're going to be wanting a grower's license. But you can also transport and condition your own hemp too, if you're a grower. But if you're a distributor, you distribute it, you handle, you store, you transport, you condition. You're talking about doing that with other people's industrial hemp. You're kind of more in a custom situation there. The idea is maybe a seed salesman is a distributor in this case, as a good example. And then if you're a processor, you process, you handle, you store. So if you're somebody, I guess maybe one of the biggest examples, of course, people talk about the different ways you can harvest and the uses for industrial hemp. Of course, the fiber, the seed, and of course the flower harvest, which is used for cannabidiol, CBD oil production. That's a lot of people's radars right now. But if you do any of those things, you take a raw material and you convert it into something processed, you're a processor at that point. I do want to point out here, as we look at this, is the Department of Ag has kind of drawn a line. What do we regulate and what do we not regulate? And we regulate industrial hemp, the plant parts, grains, or seeds. As soon as that material, industrial hemp, is converted just like now you can buy an industrial hemp bag, that becomes something that's not regulated under Senate Bill 263 and can be moved on. So as soon as you process it beyond that, then we being the plant protection weed control program don't look at it. But again, I say is if you're processing it into animal feed, then of course our dairy and feed program is going to be looking at that for making sure that follows along with FDA guidelines, which currently right now don't allow that in feed. So the other part of this too is relationships between the license, how things move. And this basically shows the relationship between grower, distributor, processor, and also legally sourced, legally imported sources of hemp. So where do we get seed from the beginning to start this program? It's obviously not here in Kansas. Those are going to be from legally imported sources of hemp from other states that have certified seed that are already licensed by their state Department of Ag that you can buy seed from and bring it into the state. We, of course, are not going to be part of that process, and we're not going to assume any sort of liability in that, but that is where this is set up to happen. Go back here to the regulations, the state educational institutions. There is some big differences between a state educational institution license and those other that we talked about. First of all, state educational institutions, only staff of the institution can be licensed. The idea of maybe potentially including a cooperator from a farm isn't allowed underneath that. That would convert it over to a grower's license. Of course, each individual must pass a background check. Applications, including research proposals, are reviewed solely by the secretary, so there's no advisory board review in this case. So basically, if you submit a completed form to us, we will okay it and get you a license. You can think of this license too as an all-in-one, so it's for processing, distribution, and growing too. There's no distinguish between it. No fees imposed, so there's no fees we'll charge you, of course, other than for the background checks you guys would be responsible for getting and submitting to us. But you cannot subcontract with an individual for land use. The idea of using a cooperator's land to do research, it needs to be university-owned property. The approval process, how does that look like? I'll cover this a little bit more later on in the session, but the idea is there is an approval process that comes along with this that's very defined. We look at submitted complete license application, including research proposal that has all people participating, maps identifying the location, acknowledgments of restrictions, and a research proposal. This is a technical bulletin that Carrie has helped provide to us. She's a member of the advisory board, talking about for farmers a resource and how can they put together a research proposal, and this helps explain it to them. We're not only going to have that as a requirement because this is a research bill, that we will provide forms and information to them to help them fill this out so that they can submit a proposal to the secretary that goes before the advisory board and for review. So they submit that, pass the background check, application fees, then those applications are reviewed by the advisory board, and they're either denied or confirmed at that point, or conditionally approved at that point. This is more details here, but the idea is if they're conditionally approved, then they submit the actual fee to us. We don't require that large licensing fee up in advance. We do afterwards, and then we'll issue a license to them. Copies of each license will be forwarded to appropriate law enforcement agencies. They'll be listed on the website. From what we've gathered from other states, and very much important with the advisory board's input, is transparency is key in the success of this program. Because if people don't know that you're growing industrial hemp and they think something illicit is going on, that's just going to cause you problems. State Advisory Board, the members are appointed by the Department of Ag, or the Secretary of Ag, no fewer than 5 and more than 9. And the idea here is this advisory board will have some sort of background in this industrial hemp knowledge, including there will be a member of the legislature on this, at least one. and they're limited to serving 2. And so the idea is not only does the advisory board consult on us in the development of rules and regs, they also approve or deny licenses based on the research proposal. And so that is a requirement under Senate Bill 263. It basically allows us not to be arbitrators of that decision on what a good research proposal is. There is a board that makes that decision for us. A fee schedule. Now this I don't know if how many people have been exposed to this, but certainly surprises a lot of people, but a grower is a $1,000 license fee, distributor $2,000. And depending on what you're processing, it may be $3,000 or $6,000. The idea here is to being able to provide us enough money to give us the personnel, the equipment, what we need to fund this program. And I mentioned earlier some of the costs we're dealing with is the idea of actually manually hand transportating samples between locations and our laboratories, very expensive. And so we have to be able to consider and offset those costs. So once you get a license, what does an inspection process look like? Everybody will be inspected the first year. Everybody will get a sample the first year. And what does that look like? We get notifications, there's reporting, we come out, we do an inspection of that location, making sure everything is in compliance. We take a sample, we submit that to our lab. If the sample fails, meaning, I guess really I haven't talked about it initially, is 0.3%. And so 0.3% and below in THC content on a dry weight basis is compliant. That is industrial hemp. If it is anything above that, that is a controlled substance at that point, and it's illegal to be possessed. We give people, though, the option of getting it retested if it fails the first time. And if it passes, we're good, we move on. If it fails again, the only thing that can be done at that point, it has to be destroyed. Certainly the scientists who talk about this will describe that a lot of things affect the quantity of THC in a plant, the environment certainly, and we acknowledge that, but it's very rigid on what this standard is. We give them a passing report of analysis if it's okay, and then they have to harvest within a certain period of time. 10 days here, but there's some exceptions if weather gets in the way or something of that nature that's out of our control to allow them more than 10 days if necessary. So if all that works out, we inspect, they pass the inspection, the sample passes, they harvest it within 10 days, we issue a harvest certificate. And that basically just states that this industrial hemp that was harvested meets the requirements. And so that harvest certificate, along with that license you get from us, will have to be maintained as you transport it and move it around the state. The intent there is if you get pulled over by a highway patrol that has a canine dog that can't tell the difference between marijuana and industrial hemp because it smells the same, you have your documentation in place to provide to them that you have industrial hemp and nothing else. That is the most common, I guess the more realistic examples. Why do we require all that? It's really to protect you as the grower, the distributor, or whatever else, because I do believe, I remember at our May 11th meeting, the speaker from Kentucky talked about several times in a couple sessions about how some of their shipments have gotten confiscated in Kansas because of our lack of allowing it, but they got pulled over and got it confiscated because it was being shipped through a state that doesn't allow it. Reports, there's some reporting requirements here. I think, Dr. Peterson, you've done biotechnology, regulatory service inspections, done some of that work. And so this, to me, it looks a lot similar to the idea of notifications of when you plant, when you're ready for harvest. All those things are required to that. But what also is in part of this too is at the end is a research report. So, of course, we have the research proposal, but the ultimate goal, what's supposed to be created from this, is some sort of results. And so at the end, each licensee will present a research proposal to us that will be compiled and shared with everybody. And so that will hopefully promote promote the understanding of this crop as we move forward. With that, I guess I'll close right there. Hopefully I filled the time I was supposed to, but I'll fill you guys in with a little bit more of what the application looks like later on in the session.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. And we have time for questions for Jeff.
Jeff, I may have missed it, but I think in your presentation, you may talk about it later with the application. With the application going in, does the tract of land need to be specified? Is that a part of that application process as well?
Very much so.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very specific, and we're going to ask for detailed maps with GPS coordinates to identify it. Something I did skip through some of the details there, but the detail of it is each license is good for a section of land. So whatever, and in this first year, it's restricted at 80 acres for that license. And so the first year, you can have 80 acres in one legally defined section is one license. But you can obtain in multiple licenses if you get approved, if you want to grow more. But yes, very much specifically, and it will be part of the application I'll show you later, is we want very detailed maps on where you're growing it so that if necessary, we can walk right up to it if we needed to. Yeah.
Jeff, certified seed. Where does the seed come from, and what legal requirements do you have to get through in order to bring it across state boundaries? Is there a federal issue that comes into play?
So that's a good question.
Will you repeat the question for that online?
I will do that. Thank you. The question is about certified seed. Where do we get it, and what legal requirements are there to bring it into the state, especially from a federal perspective? So it is okay with us to do that as long as it's a legally sourced importer. So if it's somebody who's licensed in Kentucky, for example, who has certified seed they want to sell. So certified seed, what we're looking for there is like any other crop. If you got the blue tag identifying it as certified seed, that is the documentation you need to keep in records so that when we come and ask you about that, you can prove to us it was in fact a certified variety. From an interstate transport perspective, and we've asked questions, of course the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, is primarily the agency that would be involved in that interstate regulation. That is something, a couple things play into part here. That's something that's not a priority for them, but we suggest if you're going to do that, that you register with the DEA and that the other person is registered with the DEA, and then they view it as just a transfer among registrants at that point. The other part of this is that the people reference it to us several times is the omnibus bill that was passed at the federal level prohibits agencies from spending money on enforcing interstate movement of industrial hemp. So again, it's still a controlled substance at the federal level, but there are ways, I believe, of doing it in a way that doesn't expose you to a lot of risk. But it is something that's very risky. I mean, this crop in general, if you're wanting to grow industrial hemp, is very risky. Yeah?
So, Jeff, this is research, but what comes of the harvested material from the research? Does it have to be destroyed, or?
So the question is what do you do with the material that you harvest, whether it's fiber, seed, or floral material? It can continue through the process of being processed, or between sold and being processed. At that point, we suggest people need to know in advance what they're going to do with it. But I think this kind of leads to a greater issue with this is people think and want to grow it, but being able to find the market for it, I think, might be a difficult thing for individuals to find. But it can still be sold as long as you're selling it to an individual who's licensed, but you just pass along that documentation to that individual. So when we come and inspect that processor or that distributor and we're wanting to know where did you get your industrial hemp, they can provide it and say that they got it from your farm, for example.
Kind of along those same lines, if we're importing our stuff from out of state from a certified seed distributor, are we able to come back to that collaborator and like export our stuff to them easily? How do we navigate that system?
The question is about not only importing it, but exporting it once you have a product to export. How do you do that legally? Same thing. Okay. It's a similar thing, but I would urge, it's everybody's caution. There's no liability for us in this case, but it's at the participants risk is if you transport it through the wrong states, you risk being confiscated too, and you have to know about that in advance. But we're certainly aware of it, but we're not necessarily the sole source of information on how to do that correctly. Somebody else have a question? Yeah.
And the production of, after you import certified seeds, can the institution produce their own certified seeds?
The question is about producing your own certified seed, and the answer is yes. We've been talking to Kansas Crop Improvement Association about if there is interest in doing that. They'll be assigned the certifying agency like they are with wheat production in the state. I don't know necessarily if that's going to be possible or will happen anytime soon, but yeah, there is a provision in the bill and the regulations that allow for that relationship to be established so that individuals, if they wanted to produce their own certified seed from registered seed or, you know, through that whole process, they could.
Jeff, I might ask a question with regard to a sample that failed twice. I assume that the need to destroy would simply be for a plot or a row of plants as opposed to maybe the entire field of production. Do you have a sense of that?
So to answer that, it depends on what that sample represented. At minimum, we will do one sample throughout the entire plot or whatever that grower has. If they request more because they maybe have multiple varieties and they're concerned about one varieties, we can do that. But it really comes back to what does that sample represent. If it represents the entire plot, then the entire plot would have to be destroyed.
So you failed the test, got to destroy the plot. Are you subject to prosecution at that point?
So the question is once you fail, if you fail and you have to destroy, you're subject to prosecution at that point. I did skip through a detail there that anything that tests above 2% will mandatorily be reported to law enforcement agencies. That gets into a higher level than what we normally would expect at that point. I guess at any point, if you do go above 3%, it could be considered a criminal issue, but that ultimately is dependent on the law enforcement and the attorney who would press charges in that case. So that's very, very much a gray area, independent. There's nothing that says you can't be. I would be very surprised if people would be dealing with it at that point. You know, if something tests at statistically above 0.3%, but it's still below 1%, to just hypothetically put it in that range, that anybody would look at that closely. Because obviously the stuff that's being grown for consumption is much higher than that. You know, the idea of marijuana, we're talking about percentages above 20 in some cases, but what ends up happening in those cases, we report it to them because we have to, and then they above 2%. Then it's up to them on their discretion at that point. So I answer your question. It depends.
That's in the bud.
But really, the thing about this all is the enforcement of this is a little bit. There wasn't many provisions in the bill that allows the Department of Ag to conduct normal enforcement like we normally would do with our other licensees. It's either you have a license or we yank it from you, or it's a criminal issue. We can't fine people with this, the authority we have with this, like we normally would do if somebody is in violation. And so it's a very risky thing to get involved with, but if you're doing it correctly, there is no risk. But I do want to point out is that, you know, it's that fine line there, and it depends a little bit on what the law enforcement agency and the attorney wants to do at that point. Other states have had criminal prosecutions in programs. Kentucky talks about it. We talked with one of their highway patrol or state troopers in one of our advisory board meetings, and he described that there was a handful of active cases currently through their program because of it.
Another question.
Yeah.
So just to clarify, on the percentages. So you said anything 0.3% less is okay. And so there's a buffer room between 0.3% and 2%, 2.0%?
There is, I'll try to clarify that. The question is what are the percentages or the tolerances there? Yes, 0.3% and below is okay. That is industrial hemp as defined in the bill. Anything above that is cannabis. It's a controlled substance. When we think about enforcement and mandatory reporting in our regulations, anything above 2% we have to report. Anything between 0.3 and 2% we may report. And it's up to our discretion if we feel like there's something illicit going on. We still may report during that time. If we don't think so and it was just some weird weather event or something unusual, we wouldn't have to. Yeah.
Follow-up question to that. Do you know what kind of growing conditions would increase or decrease the THC?
I might have to, the question is about growing conditions, about increasing or decreasing THC. I might have to defer to some of the experts to answer that question. I think part of this also is we're going to learn that in Kansas too. As part of the whole process of learning some of these things is figuring out what conditions work well in Kansas and what doesn't.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, okay, could you tell us again what some of the marketing options are for this? I know this is pretty early on, and I know it's fairly limited at this point, but where can we go with it, I guess?
The question is about marketing opportunities, is where can we go with selling industrial hemp? And I guess I hate to pass the buck, is I don't know. And that's part of the research process, is figuring out the markets and the economics of that, and figuring out where and what the demand is. I think some of the entrepreneurs that are out there that are talking about doing this feel like they have some markets established for cannabidiol oil extraction, etc. But that very all may depend on what ends up coming from the program.
And then, as far as like the nutritional value for livestock,
Mm-hmm.
do you have any data that would show that from like a fiber standpoint?
The question is about nutritional content for livestock. I don't. That is something that we've discussed with our feed and dairy program. And so, if you're feeding it as a raw material, I'm not for sure about that, but certainly the FDA doesn't allow it in as an ingredient in actual manufactured feed at this point.
Sure.
Jeff, since we have time, just one more question about the sampling side of things. Will individual researchers be allowed to participate in at least recommendation for the way a field is sampled? That could be important.
So you're asking about how we sample a field?
Yeah.
So as I guess as we're thinking about an inspection and sampling protocol, and I have to be honest with you, that is still to be determined. We talked about things in general. I put together a timeline here recently of all the things we have to accomplish before next year and developing that inspection protocol specifically in what we're going to do as part of that. As we look at that, we're looking at other states as examples. Kentucky, Colorado. We're at the May 11th meeting to describe their sampling protocol. We in fact had one of my staff members visit Kentucky too here recently to try to gather some more information on that. So we're looking at other states' experiences on what that might actually look like. But I can tell you is generally when we sample a plant, specifically that, maybe not necessarily the pattern, how we look at it in the field, but the plant, we're looking at the top portion of the plant that includes leaf, bud, and stem material in it.
Danny?
Kentucky, how much do they grow? What do they do with it?
Well, I don't know what will.
Actually, I think there's a marketing presentation.
That's the one.
That's the one, okay. I don't know, so any comment on that? The marketing piece?
How much is grown in Kentucky and what to market it for?
So in 2018, about 6,000 acres, a little over 6,000 acres were planted. We don't know yet how much of that will actually be harvested. So I would guess, because we had some very poor weather for crop systems this year, that maybe 4,000 acres or so could potentially be harvested. 61% of that is devoted to CBD, and then a smaller portion to a dual-purpose CBD fiber, and then the remainder to grain for mostly certified seed, not for food, and then fiber. And we do have markets in Kentucky and for all of those harvestable components.
Well, any final questions for Jeff? Looks like they're all set. Thank you very much, Jeff.
Okay. Okay, so moving along on the program, and I want to take a minute or two to give a little bit of background for today's session. So Susan Metzger assembled a team of folks, Carrie Ebert, Jason Griffin, myself, I forget who else was in the room, but we kind of talked about this session and what what we felt we needed to provide in terms of resources at the local level. I know I've visited with several of you here in the room. We've had producers coming in the door to our local offices asking questions. The media has not always been our friend on this issue in terms of the level of accuracy things have been reported with. We get a lot of headlines about industrial hemp in Kansas, but they tend to leave out of that headline that it's for research purposes. Okay, and so I know at the local level we've had a lot of questions and a lot of clarification in terms of what is and is not allowed. And so I think Jeff has given us an excellent foundation of that. And the other thing is, if you're not familiar with it yet, and my hat's off to Jeff and the KDA folks in terms of a usable informational website. If you go to the KDA Industrial Hemp webpage, they have things laid out very nicely in terms of what's the current status of the rules and regulations. You can go back and look at those presentations from that May 11th meeting. There's an FAQ document there that is a really nice piece that you can hand off to clientele, producers coming through the door. That FAQ is a really nice document that you can utilize. So KDA has done an excellent job providing us some resources that we can use to communicate to our local clientele in terms of what the law allows, where we're at in that process, and what the next steps are. So part of our goal today was to give that foundation to hopefully you leave today confident in knowing where we stand in the state from a legal standpoint, because frankly there's, in my view, some misinformation out there and a lot of what I would term irrational exuberance in terms of what industrial hemp means in Kansas today. And so you go back to, without data, you're just another person with an opinion. Okay, and so we think about where's the opportunity for K-State in this. I think we have an opportunity to be visible on this emerging topic, to not miss the boat. We think about being relevant. We think about, we've struggled with, I'll use the cover crop topic as an example. Okay, we've struggled with relevancy in that regard. And we've lost some buy-in, and that's been a challenge. We have an opportunity to be in front of this topic. We're not going to have the answers right away. There's no guarantee that hemp research is even going to occur at K-State. But we do have an opportunity here to be a conduit of information to those who are seeking it. So I think we need to keep in mind research driven. I think David's going to visit about, there's a lot of things out there that hemp is purported to do. We have very little data to back a lot of that up in terms of water use, soil remediation, all these good things that are talked about in hemp. We have a long ways to go to understanding what does that mean in the state of Kansas. So I think it's important. There was a deal this morning about listening. I think, and David mentioned yesterday in the seminar, this is bringing a lot of new clientele through the doors, people we don't typically deal with, maybe in our ag and natural resources areas. So there's an opportunity there to engage that new clientele. Listening skills are going to be important, but so is communicating that idea that we are a research-based institution. Okay, and keep bringing reality to these conversations. So anyways, that was just kind of, I think, some of the thoughts as we were putting this program together. So in the next section here before break, we were able to reach out to two agronomic experts in the field. And I know yesterday David wasn't sure he's an expert yet, but the thing is, this is a field where if you've got 5 years of experience, you are an expert, because that's where we are in this process right now. And so we got David and we've got Whitney Cranfield from Colorado State University to look at the pest management piece of it. So hopefully I think you'll enjoy the technical side of this, and also that perspective from two land-grant institutions in terms of how they've dealt with this. So I'll invite David up to the podium. David's been working on industrial hemp at UK since 2014.
Correct.
And has extensive experience in teaching, research, and extension, and so really brings that multifaceted approach to his program. Very applied program there. He's located off campus at one of the research centers, and I think hopefully you'll enjoy the perspective that David can bring to the table. And as he mentioned to me, one of his goals is to help us keep from stubbing our toes on the same things they have, that we can learn from their experiences. So with that, we'll turn that over to him.
Thank you, Lucas, very much. And I'll just say quickly how much I appreciate the invitation from Susan and Lucas to participate today. Of all the things that we've participated in, I have to say there is gratification, professional gratification, in working with folks that share the interest and perhaps helping you not stumble over some of the things that we've had to stumble over. And it's been kind of fun in that regard. So I bring greetings from my little piece of heaven on earth, nestled in the mountains of far eastern Kentucky. And I know that doesn't mean anything to you directly, but you can see that we don't do a lot of cropping in our part of the world. So, 100 acres in eastern Kentucky is a big deal. So very, very different agricultural economy than what you experience here. But again, this is our little hemp plots are scattered across the research station here, and we continue that work as we go along. So greetings from Eastern Kentucky. Jeff mentioned, did a great job with an introduction there. There are essentially three basic harvestable components from industrial hemp. I suppose you could debate, there are subcategories within each, but if we're talking about the fiber, the grain, and the cannabinoids, I'm just going to go ahead and offer that fiber and grain, they're row crops, they're very simple production systems, they're very simple processing systems, and we, in my opinion, can essentially consider them as just normal commodities, even though they clearly are nowhere near the scale of what we would use to define a commodity. But as far as the production, processing, and economics of those two harvestable components, they're very simple, very easy for all of us to understand. The cannabinoids, conversely, are exactly the opposite. Unlike anything I've ever known in agricultural production and agricultural economics, and very, very confusing, and really is the basis of the whole legal problem or the whole legal issue. And so how we address all of the issues around cannabinoids is very, very important from a land-grant perspective. So that's really what I'm going to spend all of my time on, is the cannabinoids. If we want to talk about fiber and grain, I'm happy to do that. But again, they're very simple systems that are not near as complex. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time, but I thought I would just introduce what cannabinoids are. So the one of major interest, especially with the federal government, is the delta-9 THC, which is the cannabinoid that causes intoxication. People like to use the word psychoactive, but I think we have good, strong clinical evidence now, what we'll talk about in a moment, that CBD is also psychoactive, but not intoxicating. So we've kind of, in Kentucky, gone away from psychoactive, and we worry about whether people get high or not, because really that's what the bottom line is. And so intoxicated would be high. THC is the molecule that accomplishes that. CBD is the main second cannabinoid of interest nationally and globally. And so this is the molecule that constitutes 61% of the production efforts in Kentucky today. What defines industrial hemp compared to marijuana is the absence or predominance of either of those enzymes. We are talking about the exact same precursor molecule and the exact same biochemical pathway where both are derived. And so the presence of CBD, acid form synthase, or THC acid synthase is all that determines whether a specific cannabis line is marijuana or industrial hemp. It's very interesting to me, the 0.3%. One of the first issues we had in Kentucky was, well, that's one significant digit, 0.3. So that means it can be 0.399999999. And legally, you can't really argue with that. And so basically what happens in Kentucky, if it's below 0.4%, then that means it's 0.3%. Yeah, so they don't really argue much. And really, I mean, we're all, or many of us are scientists, so, there is a margin of error, right, in sampling and in analyses, analytical techniques. So, that's probably a safe thing to say. But that's why I changed this slide from 0.3% to 0.4%. So that is exactly the definition of industrial hemp or marijuana. So less than 0.4%, we're okay, but more, we're in trouble. So I'm going to spend almost all of my time today because to me it's still a very serious part of what we do. There's a lot of ambiguity, I don't know how else to define it, on a federal level of what the ultimate regulatory framework will be for cannabinoids, and that includes CBD. And so from the dean's perspective, he's the manager of the entire college and has all these extension people and faculty, working with this, what the federal government considers a Schedule I controlled substance. That's a little worrisome, right? Our dean shares that concern, I can promise you, yes. And so we have to try to wrap our heads around this situation as best we're able. States, you well know, have forwarded legislation that makes in some cases, like Colorado, many forms of cannabis legal on a state level. They're still federally illegal, just like they always were, but on a state level, they've become legal. So that's what Kentucky has done with CBD. House Bill 333, passed in 2017, removes CBD, specifically cannabidiol, by definition, from the Schedule I controlled substance list. So that makes it legal in Kentucky to produce, process, formulate, and sell CBD. But is it legal to sell it to somebody in Kansas? Well, that's a great question, and one that I'm not about to attempt to answer. And this is why. In 2016, the USDA, FDA, and DEA issued their joint statement of principles. And it's a reasonably long document, but I'll sum it up by saying they're okay with fiber and grain, they support that work, but they're not okay with cannabinoids. They still consider all cannabinoids as Schedule I controlled substances. So 2016 is a couple of years ago. As recently as June of this year, the Congressional Research Service published an overview of industrial hemp as a potential commodity crop in the United States. They talked a little bit about cannabinoids in this report. They talked a lot about global opportunities and fiber and grain and so forth. So it might be worth your while to read that if you're going to find yourself deeply involved in research in the upcoming thing. But there's still no strict definition of, it's okay if your state passes a law, you can do whatever you want. Yeah, there's nothing like that. So we still have the ambiguity. You may or may not be aware that every so often the FDA fires off a warning letter to a CBD company somewhere in the United States. And basically, essentially, they're cease and desist letters. What you're doing is illegal, and stop it now, or we'll come and take what you have. And so, I don't know what you think, but that's a little worrisome, right? So it hasn't happened in Kentucky. I think the most recent one that I'm aware of is about 3 months ago, and they're all over the country. They're not all in Colorado, they're not all in California, they're scattered about here, there, and across the different states. So a very, very recent and very interesting revelation or event was the approval of Epidiolex X by the FDA as a new drug, prescription-only drug, for the treatment of Dravet syndrome and another syndrome that I can't remember the name, but both result in very frequent and severe seizures in young children. And CBD has been clinically now, so now we have science, okay, clinically proven to be an effective treatment for these syndromes. And so the FDA has approved the use of Epidiolex, which is a CBD-based drug, for the treatment of these syndromes. And of course, the CBD world just about jumped out of their britches. They're so excited about it. So, and you know, that's the best thing that could ever have happened. But the bottom line is, it's still a prescription-only compound. You can't run to the store and buy it like we can, whatever, aspirin. You know, you have to see a physician. You have to have a prescription. And so, you know, I'm not sure how that addresses the ambiguity. To me, they haven't minced any words at all. They've made it very, very clear. And then as an aside, or really, I think, in reaction to the approval of Epidiolex by the FDA, the DEA released this, what they have called final order, and this is just a couple of weeks ago, 2 weeks ago this past Friday, so very, very recent. And basically what they've done is reschedule CBD only as formulated as Epidiolex, not all CBD, only Epidiolex as a Schedule 5 controlled substance. Well, again, the CBD world said, oh, this is great. Well, it's still a controlled substance. So it still is only handled by, distributed by, and so on and so forth under very, very strict regulations. So it's not a free and open market by any stretch of by any definition. So I looked really hard. Well, what does that mean exactly? Does that mean it will always be prescription only? I can't find that on the FDA or DEA websites. You can find guidelines for writing prescriptions and this and that, but I never could find where it said all Schedule 5 compounds are prescription only drugs. So I have a daughter-in-law that's a clinical pharmacist, and I asked her what her opinion was. Clearly, that's not the end-all be-all, but she said there are some Schedule 5 compounds that are behind the counter. So you have to ask the pharmacist for them, and they keep a log book, like Sudafed, right? Yeah, so it's not really, you know, publicly available on the internet, but you have to ask the pharmacist, but you don't need a prescription. So bottom line is, a Schedule 5 controlled substance is still not exactly, I think, what the CBD world, I know for sure it's not, we're hoping might happen on a federal level. So this is a direct quote from that DEA final ruling, and it says that until now it's been Schedule 1, but this order, it's now a Schedule 5, but everybody that manufactures, touches it, or whatever has to comply with the requirements of the Controlled Substance Act. Regarding Schedule 5 controlled substances. And furthermore, and I'll just note I did not italicize this, any other material that's not Epidiolex is still a Schedule 1 controlled substance, so you'll go to jail. Yeah, so that's, you know, that's as serious as it gets. So I offer that we have the same ambiguity that we've always had. It's really no clearer, except for, thank goodness, and I say this in the most positive of ways, for young children with Dravet syndrome and the other syndrome. That's the most positive thing that possibly could have happened. So that's very, very good. All right, so very quickly, you're aware of the Hemp Farming Act, 2018 Hemp Farming Act. If that passes as it's written, and that's certainly not a accepted thing, we don't know yet, it will redefine industrial hemp. And so the previous final ruling refers directly to the Controlled Substance Act and everything defined as marijuana within the Controlled Substance Act. So if the definition of marijuana is changed in the Controlled Substance Act, then perhaps, you know, that creates more ambiguity because that doesn't mean, I mean, Sudafed is not, you know, something that we really normally worry about, but it's a controlled substance. In other words, the FDA continues regulatory oversight of that compound. Well, Congress had nothing to do with that, right? So just because they redefine marijuana doesn't mean the FDA won't say, well, whatever, you know, CBD's dangerous. We need to know more about it. We're going to keep a hold on it for a while. So, Dean, I'm sorry, but the bottom line is we don't know a thing more today than we've ever known with CBD. And so it's iffy, and there's no pat answer in how to proceed as a land-grant university in that direction. And so we shoot from the hip is essentially what we do. And clearly, we always try to err on what we would call the safe side or the less controversial side. And that's problematic sometimes with the industry. They want answers now. They want our university doing this and doing that, and maybe we're willing to, maybe we're not. And it's a conundrum. I'm not gonna try to sugarcoat that. It's potentially a problem. The Kentucky program, I've noticed some differences based on your description. I'll just offer that from a university perspective, we're very fortunate that they manage the DEA relationship, the Kentucky Department of Agriculture does, so we don't have to do that. And that's very, very positive, I think, for more than one reason. So I've already mentioned, I'm going to offer that fiber and grain work is very simple. It's just like any other commodity, whether you're working with hemp or corn or wheat, it really doesn't matter. The production systems for those commodities are not at all similar to illicit cannabis operations, and so law enforcement will connect to that very quickly. The varieties are not the same, they don't look the same, the production is just very, very different, so that's not going to be any problem. Cannabinoid research is much more complex, and we're just not going to know, I don't think, for the immediate future exactly where CBD is going to end up as far as a final, ultimate regulatory framework goes. And in addition to that, something that causes me great angst as a university researcher is the undefinable economics of the CBD industry today. And I believe I've included a slide I have that, so this is 2017 data from the Kentucky Department of Agriculture. If we look at the average yield pounds per acre of floor material in 2017, about 1,000 pounds per acre, and then the average value per pound, $7.20, $7,200 an acre. Are you working with any other commodity that's worth that? No, not even close. So let me note that the very day they publish that, they immediately get calls and emails to KDA. I love it that I can say KDA in either direction. That's very handy. Yeah. They get phone calls about, oh, well, we pay farmers $30 a pound. Right, so $30,000 an acre. Right, so from 7,000 to 30,000, it's somewhere in between. So again, I'll refer to ambiguity. There's not a well-defined economic structure surrounding the CBD space. It's very, very ambiguous. Just frankly and bluntly, it's not always positive. In other words, when you have that much money associated with an activity, it's not surprising that there might be some less than ethical activity. And so from a university perspective, you really have to be cautious who you align your research program with. It's a conundrum, and there's not a pat answer. I can't tell you, don't work with them. You know, that's not my place. Yes, sir?
Can you explain that? I mean, is the floral, is it obvious what that is? That floral shops? What is the?
I'm sorry, I don't think I understood your question exactly.
You have floral listed up there as a use. Can you explain that?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Yeah, so the floral material in its optimal form is an unpollinated female flower from hemp. And so it's exactly the harvestable component from other forms of cannabis that are cannabinoid centered. Does that make sense? Yeah, so you're talking about the bud, and depending on the variety, they may be the size of a quarter, and several will fit in the palm of your hand, or they may be large, conical shaped flowers that I should have included a photo. So I'm referring only to the female flower, and optimally an unpollinated female flower. So not part of a grain production system or anything like that. Make sense? Good. Okay, so I guess if I had to provide a little bit of advice to our extension people, which we've done already several times actually over the last several years, here's a few things that you might try to wrap your head around. You will receive a huge amount of interest from a very, very diverse segmentation of your population. So you'll be dealing with serious producers, people you've dealt with your entire extension career, the same people. Some of them will be interested, all the way to people that know absolutely zero about any agricultural system, period. End of story. And everything in between. So a lot, and I mean a lot, emails, every day, and I'm not even extension. And phone calls, emails all the time. It just doesn't stop. So as an extension person, you're going to be asked for meetings, for trainings, and it's not going to stop. And so Jeff has already talked a little bit about this, and we've had some issues. Extension agents. What if they have a disease and they need this plant to be transported to the plant diagnostic lab, which I understand is right here on campus here. Yes, it is in Lexington too. Well, if you're in Western Kentucky, can you grab this bud, right? Put it in your state car and drive it to Lexington? If you're an extension agent, yeah, that's a little bothersome, right? So you have to define these things. You have to have rules and regulations that define these things. So our rule is no, you can't do that. You need to provide the grower with all the information they need to accomplish that on their own, including GPS directions or whatever to the diagnostic lab, but you cannot transport that material in your state car. Yeah, and that's just one example of several. But we have people that contact me all the time. Agents, I hear from them regularly. I don't want to tell this guy. I don't want to tell them how much nitrogen to put on that crop. I don't want to tell him what to do about corn earworms that Whitney will talk to us about in a bit. But it's a totally different extension experience than anything else you probably have been exposed to today. We had some very successful field days. The interest is huge. Way bigger field days than any other commodity at the college. We continue to have a lot of legislative interest. Our General Assembly, they visit and ask questions regularly, and we relish that relationship. It's been very, very positive in both directions, in my opinion. And then on the federal level too, we've had lots and lots of meetings with the majority leader, Senator McConnell, and we don't hear as much from our other congressional delegates. James Comer some, but we've met with Senator McConnell multiple times, and of course he's the key guy with that Hemp Farming Act, and so again, it's a lot of fun to be involved in that, because I never met the majority leader in all of my previous academic life. They never visited the research farm and said, "I want Williams." Yeah. So just some very quick conclusions then. I can't overstate. Be prepared for just a level of interest that you've never experienced in any activity through the Extension Service. They're just, and it hasn't, so we're 5 years in. I still, to this day, get an equal number of emails. I spent an hour on the phone this morning with a young lady at UK doing an interview about the hemp research program. So that's not an extension thing, but it never ends. It goes on and on and on. I'll ask the dean's understanding that you as the administrator of the college, helping extension define what KSU role will be is so very important. You are where the buck stops. Ultimately, and so your communication going in both directions is just so very important for an efficient thing. And so UK, I don't know how exactly it evolved, but we've been very, very fortunate that we've had full administrative support, and it's made the program so much healthier and so much more productive with the administrator's support. So I'm hopeful you'll be able to arrange that too. I'm going to offer our relationship with the KDA has been so wonderful, continues that way, and that's imperative to success of the program as well. And so keeping in touch with the KDA, keeping abreast of the regulations like you're trying to do today with Jeff's presentations and others. But that's not just today, that's forever, because things are going to change, and you're going to meet people and discover issues that he won't know anything about without your input. And so that, again, that two-way communication is just key to success. I'm going to offer too that, you kind of need to keep up with all this stuff like the things I just showed you a minute ago, the joint principles and blah, 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 all that federal, because you're going to get questions about that stuff. You're going to be asked questions about it. And I don't know about you, but I'd rather say, well, yeah, I don't know. Ask them. So it's more work, folks. That's basically what it boils down to, because it's new and it's ambiguous, and so it's just more work. I will say the bottom line is that it's been fun, and there are serious, real agricultural participants in the program, and it's fun to help them. It's fun to watch them succeed, and it's fun to contribute to that success as a university faculty member or extension person. So I think it's okay to embrace the opportunity and do things legally, clearly, and right. But if you, it's gratifying. It's a lot of fun to help folks along. And that's my email address if you want to take a photo. I didn't bring a big pile of cards. I'm happy to answer any questions today or later by email. I don't know if I think that's about what I was supposed to do. 20 minutes.
Do we have questions for Doc? Okay. Maybe time for a question or two.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm just curious, in Kentucky, is the same requirement that the growth is all on university-owned land for the research? Because you talk about the, producers that you work with. I guess I'm thinking that if it's, for us, if it's on university property,
Right.
it would be private people.
Right. So the university in Kentucky has a very different relationship with the KDA than the regulations are stipulating the KDA here will have with the university. So I can grow hemp, I can have research on private land, and it's part of my program. And the producer or the landowner is not part of that process. And so it's up to me to submit the GPS coordinates and be responsible for all of the activities on that land. And so rather than that person become a participant, I'm the participant. And so clearly on university land, it's not an issue. Now, we do provide GPS coordinates for every single thing we plant. But I'll tell you this very quickly. We had a call from the state police at our station. We also manage 10,000 acres of forest in eastern Kentucky. State police called and said, we've had a tip, anonymous, that you have dope in the forest. And we want to, which is not unusual, by the way. I mean, eastern Kentucky is known, yeah, right. So I said, well, I checked it out, couldn't find, anything that would lead me to think that was accurate. I said, but a lot of times people confuse the station with the forest. It's all Robinson, so sometimes there's confusion. And I have a lot of hemp here. So maybe somebody drove by, saw the hemp, and that's what they were talking about. He said, well, I didn't know you had hemp there. Yeah, that was kind of weird. I mean, they were supposed to be fully informed at all the time, so I called the KDA, and it was just that one guy. I mean, his command post knew about it, but just that one guy wasn't informed, so that was kind of weird. Yeah. Other questions or not? Maybe later, I guess.
I need that.
Yeah.
Well, this is my fault. The IT guys cringed because I clicked the wrong box, so. I think we'll still get the slides up. We'll want to introduce Dr. Whitney Cranshaw with Colorado State University, and it's really privileged again. We can draw on some expertise, and the other nice thing here is, agronomically we got a lot of similarities between Colorado and Kansas, and so again we have that opportunity to look at what the folks at CSU are doing, and certainly have the benefit of a lot of that being directly applicable to some of the same challenges we might encounter from an agronomic standpoint here in Kansas. Dr. Williams, you got our clicker yet? All right, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over. We're running we'll make sure we get Dr. Cranshaw gets his time, and we'll go from there.
Okay, great, thank you. So Colorado is also a pretty big state in terms of producing hemp. I think we've got 17,000 acres this year, had 12,000 last year. And I'm an entomologist, so this will have a lot of bug pictures in it. But I just want to talk a little bit about the crop, and David brought up most of the important points here. When we're talking about hemp, it is defined as being some sort of cannabis species, usually cannabis sativa, that has less than 0.3% THC, the psychoactive compound. That's hemp, broad sense. But what type of crop is it? It is several different crops, and it's several different crops from an entomological point of view too. You get different things from these cannabis species plants. One of them you would get would be psychoactive compounds, and that would be marijuana. So, for instance, in our state where our Constitution allows us to have legalizes marijuana, you'll see it being grown for little tiny buds. The unfertilized female flowers that are high in THC. But we're talking about things that don't have THC in it. For CBD or for food, or for fiber, or for seed. So hemp, when it's being grown for fiber or for seed, is done by seeding. You have high plant populations. The crop is a mixture of male and female separate plants, or you might have monoecious plants, but it is pollinated. This is a wind-pollinated crop, and then you get seed. It is also, by the way, if you're growing it in our area, we get a lot of use by bees in this crop. It is a super pollen crop in arid areas where you don't have alternative kinds of pollen sources in August and September when this is flowering. I've never seen anything so full of honeybees, bumblebees, various kinds of solitary bees as well. Because again, in our area, we don't have a lot of agricultural areas. We don't have a lot of alternative flowering plants that are producing pollen for bees during that period of time. Hemp being grown for CBD is what essentially everybody is doing. And it is a totally different crop. It's grown more like a horticultural crop. It is typically grown starting from cuttings. Most people have been doing this from cuttings, from mother plants, so there is a greenhouse production phase in this, and this is so that you have genetics that you're sure of, because you cannot go above 0.3%, then it's crappy marijuana, or above 3.999%, I guess now. But anyway, so this is how it's primarily is produced. You have a greenhouse operation, you have your clones, and that's not in the Kansas law the way I hear it. You couldn't do that. You get rooted cuttings, you then transplant them. Your infield populations are low. Sometimes it's grown drip. A lot of people, the biggest, best looking field that I've ever seen was drip irrigated and very high production. These plants, in the future, I think we will see seeded varieties that are grown for CBD. This has got to be developed, but there's a lot of companies that are developing cultivars that are probably going to be able to produce high CBD from a seed. They just have to work out the genetics right. But there's a lot of private people doing this, developing these cultivars. None of these are certified seed yet. And one thing about certified seed in Colorado, it is being done in our state. One of the things to certify it is that we require it be grown in different parts of the state to make sure that that seed stays true to being below 0.3%. So it's grown in high elevation, low elevation, west slope, eastern Colorado, everywhere. And it has to pass all that before our Department of Ag says that variety can be certified by the Colorado Department of Ag. And there's not very many varieties that are certified yet. So entomologically, there are, I think, 3 different crops that I would deal with, whether it's hemp, that is a cultivar being grown for seed or fiber, hemp being grown for CBD, or the indoor culture of whatever kind of cannabis you're growing. Those have different entomology issues. So, it's been very enjoyable for me to be able to visit grower fields over the past several years to describe what we see in our area in terms of arthropods. And it does have a lot of bugs in it. They have, you can see a robust complement of all the various natural enemy species that you find in ag crops. Lady beetles aren't in this picture, but they'd certainly be there. It also has various things that chew on the leaves, And these are usually what growers most often notice. We have various kinds of caterpillars in particular, 9 species of caterpillars I found chewing on leaves and buds, and certain beetles, but grasshoppers are probably the most important defoliator in some of our areas, and mostly field edges, but one thing grasshoppers will do is they'll often also gnaw on some of the twigs. However, I mean, hemp can tolerate defoliation, even though that's the most obvious thing. I think this crop will be able to tolerate defoliation very well. I mean, in just looking at what happens in hailstorms, I mean, I've seen it hit by hail in several different fields, and another crop right across the road, say melons or something like that, they'll be atomized. And the hemp fields look great, or pretty good. I mean, they're beat up, but heck, they're made of rope. I mean, it is one tough crop in terms of hail damage. There are some borers. The European corn borer is reported to go into the crop. I have never seen it in Colorado, but that's the one insect that was reported as being a pest of it when it was grown in the Midwest in the 1940s during World War II. Eurasian hemp borer, though, that's up and coming. That's the one that there's also, all sorts of fluid feeding things that feed on the aphids, leafhoppers, false chinch bugs, that feed on the fluids of the plant, on the leaves. Also several stink bugs, lygus bugs, you find feeding on the seeds. That could be important if we are growing this for seed, but never super important yet. But particular damage is caused by species that are feeding on the buds, those developing flower parts that are high in CBD, which is what, again, most of these people are growing it for. In terms of insects that seem to be the ones that settle out as key pests on this crop, the first one is cannabis aphid. This is an aphid that just goes on cannabis species. We didn't even know it was in the United States until 2 years ago. And now we find it's everywhere. I mean, we can find it from Virginia, we can find it in Oregon, we can find it in Minnesota, we can find it everywhere. We just didn't know because people couldn't look at it. It was illegal. But anyway, it's everywhere. And it's just, and by far, that's the aphid we have. Probably the thing that surprises me how important this is an area-phyid mite that is also probably specific on cannabis species called hemp russet mite, and it causes a bronzing, a light bronzing of the foliage, but in particular it inhibits bud formation. And this is one that is much more damaging than I had thought a year ago. I saw a lot of injury in eastern Colorado this year. So this would be, you'd have to know what a healthy plant looks like, but these are not plants that are vigorous green, and the new growth is being blasted back a little bit. And then this Eurasian hemp borer, this is the one that really surprised me. This is a tiny little moth, and it develops in the stalks, kind of like a corn borer, but it's far smaller. I don't know if you've ever heard of the oriental fruit moth, but it's that genus. Fairly small moths. They'll get in the stems. They'll also, late in the season when you're getting developing buds, they'll tunnel up at the top of the plant, and that will kill the buds out. So this would be the kind of injury you'd see. And this is an insect I've been finding all over eastern Colorado, and clearly it is something that must have been feeding and developing on some sort of wild host that we never paid attention to. This is it's an LBM, a little brown moth. Nobody pays attention to that until it becomes a crop pest. Anyway, so these are something I think we need to look more at. But the big one has been corn earworm. I mean, this insect that is such an important insect on so many crops. It's the only insect that has 3 official common names by the Entomological Society of America. Corn earworm when it's in corn, tomato fruitworm when it's in peppers and tomatoes, and the bollworm when it's in cotton. This one it can be quite common in hemp late in the season as we're getting big buds. And it's a very variable caterpillar, as you've probably seen it on other crops. But what this one will do is it will tunnel right into the buds and will kill it late in the season. And this is, I think, because of the way hemp comes on, it's maturing in September. Corn is no longer a suitable crop for it. They all jump in the hemp fields. In both 2016 and 2018, we had some serious losses, particularly CBD cultivars in the Arkansas Valley area. Arkansas Valley area, which is the biggest production area we have in Colorado, the southern Colorado area. But it's grown all over the state. So corn earworm, big outbreak of moths in September. We see lots of moths, lots of egg laying, and then late season damage. We did this year have it bad in a couple of fields, but we caught it this year a lot better. So we do have, I have been working on this for 3 or 4 years now, and we have actually a hemp insect website where I've been trying to describe every single insect we have on the crop, with the idea being that people, if they understand what they're seeing, they can deal with it more easily. If they don't know what it is, they always assume it's the worst thing. But anyway, we have sheets on everything. This would be what we have on corn earworm, which is actually a key pest. Also have a management program for corn earworm. And this is one that is adapted from how we manage corn earworm in sweet corn, and basically involves a program where we use pheromone traps to monitor the flights of the insect, to detect if there's peak periods of adult activity. So these would be the pheromone traps we've got out. I had about, I think, 8 growers using this year, scattered around the state. And if very high numbers of moths are discovered during this critical flowering period late in the summer, we're telling people that you should probably treat. And we do have treatments. There are 2 things that we are recommending. One is a specific strain of BT and 2 specific products, and the other is a virus. So these are products that we allowed. And these are Colorado allowable insecticides. So this comes up to one last thing I want to talk about, is the pesticide conundrum with this crop. You might hear there's no pesticides that are registered for hemp. Well, there's no pesticides that say hemp on the label, but that can be, I think, argued to not preclude that there are some pesticides that are allowable. All registered pesticides cannot be legally applied to a site on which their use is either contraindicated or inconsistent with the label instructions. Okay, and presently, the agency that would oversee any pesticide labeling, the EPA, doesn't recognize hemp. They won't talk about it. They won't deal with it at all. Forget it. It's somebody else. They're going to be grabbed kicking and screaming into dealing with the regulatory issues of this crop. But they're not players because they don't want to be. This whole issue about pesticide use on any cannabis crop started with marijuana, but it applies to all cannabis crops. Cannabis being cannabis sativa, the plant, whether it's hemp or whatever. We've gone through different phases. Originally, what I call the Wild West phase was when all registered pesticides were considered illegal. Pesticide regulation enforcement was ignored. We ignored it in our state. Nobody did anything. Growers were unaware of pesticide laws or ignored them. Nobody's talking about it, so just assume they could use anything. And all pest management information on that situation devolves to the internet and hearsay, a very bad place to be. And I could tell you horror stories of what people were doing before our state stepped up and came up, gave some sensibility to this. So this changed in 2013. Washington State was the first one to step up, I think, and do a really reasonable finesse of this whole situation. And then Colorado followed about 18 months after that. So basically what Washington State did, because they also had a constitutional amendment that allowed marijuana production at the same time we did, But several years later, they came up with this. They allowed pesticides that were allowed for use in that state was certain ones if their active ingredient was exempt from food crop tolerances. The label had it was written in a way that was did not prohibit use. It was an unspecified use. I'll show you all these anyway. So I'll go through this one. I'll show you how our state is doing it. In the state finesse phase, some pesticides were identified by state agencies as being allowable in cannabis production. There still remains an uneasy alliance with federal agencies that should be the ones who are giving clarity on this, but they have not done it. And in this phase that I think we're in, we can provide some support in terms of helping with pest management issues. So the way that many states have done it who have addressed this is their State Department of Agriculture has lists of allowable products that can be used on these crops. And if you go pesticides, Colorado, pesticides allowable, Colorado, you come to their website for our Department of Ag. Not all states have such lists. This is something each state has been doing a little bit differently from each other. So in Colorado, the kinds of things that are required for it to be an allowable product on a cannabis species kind of crop is the first thing, as I mentioned, active ingredient is exempt from food crop tolerance. There's only a handful of products. Mostly these are natural products. Certain oils, soaps, microbials, and the like. The label has directions for use on unspecified food crops, including unspecified food crops grown as bedding plants. What that means, I don't know if you've ever read many pesticide labels, but if you see a pesticide label that has this kind of wording at the very top, says crops, including but not limited to, bingo, that's what you're looking for, those kind of labels. If they say corn and only corn, then you can't use it. So our department is looking for ones that also have that. Our department also says it has to be EPA registered and registered within our state, and we're the only state that does this. It also has to be registered on tobacco, which personally I think they went overboard a little bit, but that's what they have. And so if you go to what Colorado has come to, they have, again, this website. If you go, they update the list of what are specifically allowable products in our state. You hit the little button and boom, you get this printout and it says these are the products that are allowed in our state. Most of these, by the way, are also the kinds of products that would be allowed in certified organic production, but that's incidental. Now, different states have done different things. California is struggling with this whole thing right now, although they're more interested in marijuana than hemp, but they're all in the same basket until that goes through. And essentially, they have a list of all the active ingredients that they're allowing. They don't say, they're not going to individual products. They're not looking at individual labels. They're saying these are the active ingredients. If your pesticide contains that, they're allowed to be used for insect control. At some point in the future, when hemp grows up as a crop and the federal agencies get their act together and figure out what they're going to do about this, and the pesticide issue will work out differently, but it will very likely vary by the type of hemp crop and use. So for instance, I can see that hemp being grown for fiber and seed, that could be considered just another crop group 20, oil seed kind of crop, and probably be registered for, probably have a lot of registrations, including herbicides. There's no presently good herbicides that are allowed in our state. But at some point I could see that, and if it was a fiber crop, and that was in the bottom, fiber crop, I could see them registering lots of pesticides being put into a fiber group. But CBD, I don't have any hopes of that getting many more pesticides than what the state finesse phase has come up with, because there's some serious registration problems with that. For one, this is a kind of product that you extract the CBD is extracted from the material you grow. And so there might be different ways that residues might be extracted at the same time. All that has to be looked at. It's also used differently. It's ingested. Sometimes it's inhaled. All these are different routes of potential exposure. A lot of residue work, tolerance work would have to be done to register, I think, any more pesticides than what we have right now for this. Anyway, sometime do check out, we do have this hemp insect website. It's a work in progress, but if you just do hemp insects, I think it's the only one that comes up still. Anyway, that's it for general comments I had. Any questions? Yeah.
What about the honey from the bees?
So it doesn't produce honey. It only produces pollen. So there is hemp honey that people are selling. That's bull. They're infused. It's honey that's infused, which I think is probably illegal to. Anyway, it's a pollen source, and pollen is what is used for development mostly of the young bees. It's the protein, vitamins, and stuff. But you do not get nectar. But pollen's an important resource for bees too. Yeah. Yeah.
Do the next generation of bees tend to be attracted to Cheetos or Doritos?
No, well, there's no THC in this, what we're talking about. No, it's, yeah. I don't know, that'd be another study. That'd be a fun study. Talk about fun studies, yeah. Anything else? Anyway. All right.
Other questions for Dr. Cranshaw?
Yeah.
Does anybody try to trap crop
For the corn earworm?
the whole worm, corn earworm?
Yeah, somebody mentioned late planted corn. I mean, if you had corn that was green silk late, yeah, that might work too. I mean, as long as I think if we just monitor and get, we have products that can work to control it with the virus and the BT products. We just need to know if it's a outbreak situation. I mean, in this year we had traps everywhere. We only one place where we had an outbreak, and most of the growers were in on that, and they treated with the BT product. But the other places we had the traps, it wasn't a bad year. It's an insect you have to monitor every year. Every year is a brand new ball game. And there's also something that needs to be worked out, I think, in terms of when hemp becomes attractive to the adults of that, because I saw a field that had different maturing, and some were just hammered, and ones next to it weren't, and it was the same cultivar. So they were at a certain flowering stage when the egg laying was going on that one of many questions has to be figured out. Yeah.
So, are they using tillage for weed control for them?
They're using.
When they hurt?
Yeah, and there's a bunch of fields that particularly organic people, after 2 or 3 years, I mean, their fields look terrible. I mean, it's just all weeds. Bindweed and the like. I mean, the really good producing are people who know how to grow the crop. They're growing it conventionally. They're rotating. The fields aren't very weedy to be in the first place, and they can keep the weeds under control. But some of these are not. A lot of people are not going to make it. But there's some people who are figuring out how to grow this crop, and there are people who know how to grow crops. They're the ones who are really doing it. Yeah. Okay.
All right, let's thank Dr. Cranshaw for his time. Okay, we ran just a little bit into break. The game plan is there's Call Hall ice cream up on second floor. We'll reconvene here at 3:30. Brent Young from CSU is unable to make it due to a family emergency.
We're going to ask Jeff to come back and talk to us a little bit further about
that there may be changes, but we hope nothing too significant, because if that's the case, then we have to start that process over, and it delays things, and that's not good for getting this program started in 2019. So as we look at the application process, and that basically what we're looking at here is what does it take to apply to the program as we currently see it. Just a little bit of review from the previous presentation. What does it take, the approval process, and actually this is defined in regulations, but they have to submit a complete application, you have to identify your location, you have to have a research proposal with it, you have to submit a background check. All these things have to be part of the application packet as it's submitted before you're even considered for a license. This kind of defines if you're conditionally approved and the advisory board okays the research proposal. You have to pay the fees associated with it at that point, and then you get your licenses issued. Not only the primary applicant, but each individual that's listed. Here's important, 2 deadlines here. For the 2019 growing season, it's March 1st. I do want to point out is we cannot accept applications until the regulations are effective. Full-on applications. But what we're looking at doing, and this is still trying to formulate the messaging and what we can do that can kind of follow along with the law, is potentially for the opportunity for individuals to submit, I guess what we'll term a pre-application, which has some of these components in it. There may be an opportunity for some review so that as the full application becomes available, when the regulations become effective, it will speed along that process. Because if I mentioned earlier, if it's the 3rd week in January when these regulations are effective and we have a deadline on March 1st for applications for the 2019 year, that's a pretty quick turnaround to get all this stuff turned in accurately. But we're confident we can get that done this year. But as we get into more of a cycle with this in the out years, this year's special because the rules and regs are being adopted at a later date. The deadline will be November 30th of the prior year, so that's very early on. The reason being is we look at the application deadline versus the license expiration date, which the license expiration date will be on January 30th of the following year it's issued. That's a 2-month difference there. People who want to continue operations can have their application submitted and potentially get a new license issued to them by January 30th so that they can continue if they're processing, distributing, potentially growing in a greenhouse too. That's a possibility through the winter months and can continue that. So those are important here. And so as we get through the application, it is extensive, but we're trying to turn these things around fast. So what does a packet look like? First of all, this is unlike any other license we issue in the department, especially the ones I deal with. Most of the time, like with live plant dealers or seed licenses, you provide us your name, your information, maybe where you're at and your fee, bam, you get a license. In this case, it's not. There's a lot of instructions and information you have to complete to make it work. As we look at this, we cover this. There's actually a $200 non-refundable application fee. Now, I do want to point out this is for growers, distributors, and processors. The state university license does not generate fees. We do not require fees with that. But if this is a grower's license packet, which is actually quite similar to what the distributors and the processors will look like, so we're just going to go through this one. It talks a little bit about what's required. You can submit it to us electronically. We do not have this year the capability of taking some sort of online application. It will be a PDF that you guys will either fill out with a fillable form, sign it, send it back to us through an email, print it out, or mail it to us. Hopefully in the future our database can grow and allow for that, but right now we just don't have the time or the capability of getting that done. It talks a little bit about prohibited activities. I did skip over some stuff in the first presentation. I didn't cover site use restrictions, some other prohibited activities, but we'll maybe touch on them a little bit as we go through the application. Because this application is actually your agreement to comply with the license requirements. I know in Kentucky, for example, I'll use them as an example because we studied them quite a bit. They have an application followed later by a grower's agreement. We don't have that step here. It's once you actually sign this application, acknowledging all the acknowledgments and that you're going to comply with it, that is saying that you're going to comply with the regulations and allow us to kind of gain access to your property to do inspections, all those types of things before you ever get a license. The next page here refers to a little bit of the restrictions. You know, you can't grow within 50 foot of a structure that's intended for residential purposes near a K through 12 public school or public recreational area, except with permission of the secretary. On property owned or leased from a person who's ineligible or who was terminated from denied from the admission program. The idea then is if you're renting property from maybe somebody who has a drug offense in their past, they actually have to be licensed too. So if it's a tenant landowner situation, both of those people will have to be licensed as we look at this situation. If that landowner can't comply with the background check requirement, the license can't be issued. We also mentioned the idea, as Dr. Crenshaw mentioned earlier, about the pesticide labels. We basically are saying you can't do that if it's a violation of state or federal law, and so on. Here is some of the important deadlines for a grower's agreement. There's the application deadline, the field planning report, the voluntarily withdrawal report. We're talking about the withdrawal report. It's the idea is if you have a crop failure, you need to notify us. Because we don't want to come out to your field and you said you planted 20 acres of hemp and there's nothing there or there's 5 acres still there. What happened to that other 15 acres? And so we want to know about that. A pre-harvest report, that's telling us that you're about ready to harvest within 30 days. A production report saying what you'd harvested. And then the research report. All that is due prior to the application deadline or the process for the next year. The point being here is so that your ability to get another license is very much built on your ability to comply with the requirements in the prior year too. So if you can't comply, most likely you won't be able to get a license for the next year. I want to jump back there too. And I can't remember necessarily sharing this earlier, but as we think about what is legal and not legal as far as possessing industrial hemp, it is very clear in the statute that not only do you have to, when you possess industrial hemp, but to be legal, you also have to have a license with the Department of Agriculture. So if you're transporting raw material industrial hemp, and you're not licensed with us, technically you could be prosecuted for possession at that point because you're not licensed. This has come up several times when we think about distributors, that some of these CBD oil facilities that are selling it right now in Kansas are also selling buds of industrial hemp and thinking it's legal, in fact, when it's not, because they are not licensed with us because these rules and regulations are not effective. So just be aware of that. What that comes down to is then it's up to the local law enforcement and the county attorney to deal with it at that point. If they choose not to, they choose not to at that point. So just a kind of a side note as we're going forward here. Here are the licensing fees again. I covered those earlier. It's just to make sure people know as they're leading into applying that if you want a license, there is a cost associated with doing that. $1,000 for a grower, $3,000 for fiber, $3,000 for grain processor, $6,000 for floor material, $2,000 for license fee for distributor. Now, I do want to point out is that these fees were discussed a lot with our advisory board, and I indicated the costs we were expecting versus the revenue that we needed to have to do it. Of course, we get no state general fund money to run this program. It has to be self-funded. And so this breakdown of fees was at the recommendation of the advisory board. And they really pointed out at these high-value floral producers, you know, the idea of people who are extracting CBD from the buds of industrial hemp, get a lot of revenue from their activities, and that they should front more of the cost of running this program. And that is why that's set up that way. Not necessarily because the cost of inspecting them is more, because it's not. It's just because of the value associated with that. And then that way, then the grower is actually being supplemented a little bit with the cost of regulation there. It costs more for us to inspect a grower than just $1,000. Or regulate, inspect, and enforce. And here's finally the first part of the application. Obviously, very common stuff, primary applicant information. So I want to kind of reiterate some ideas here. There's the applicant, that's the primary licensee. It's the person who's responsible. But then we have a secondary list here of anybody who's involved with it who are secondary licensees. Because by statute, we're supposed to license everybody. Whether they have a financial role in it, they're handling it. In some case, if they're a crop consultant and they're coming in and consulting and saying you should put in, walking through the field and checking for moisture to set irrigation schedules, that person would need to be listed here. All right. A crop consultant would not get an individual license, a primary license themselves as a grower. They would just be listed on the grower's applications as they submit them.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's interesting about the comment about crop consultants. So is the threshold is the threshold that anybody who will be within that area?
Mm-hmm. That would be one of them. The other thing too is if you're 10% or more of the industrial hemp being grown or stored, I guess will own 10% or more. So it could be a financial thing too. We learned that from Colorado. Colorado experienced some problems with not having that disclosed, and so we put in similar requirements. You're exactly right. So if you're possessing or part of that you would need, or involved in it in the field, you would need to have a license to legally be there. I mean, I guess the hypothetical situation, I don't know if this would ever happen, is if you're walking through a hemp field. Of course, industrial hemp looks a whole lot different than anything else. And the local law enforcement official shows up and you're through this hemp field that he didn't know about, he should have known about, but he didn't know about. You didn't have a license to prove that you could be there. It could cause you some trouble. I guess that could be a hypothetical situation. We also talk about, are you a KDA employee? It's again some of those conflict of interest issues that we might run into. Here are some acknowledgments about the location. So we're leading into the next page where we're talking about how are you going to describe that location where you're planting. And it's not the best scenario, but there's some terms that we use to help describe the location because each license covers a section, right? So to kind of follow in line with the idea of research, we call it a licensed research section, right? So that's one section. So you have a license that covers that one section. But granted, you're not going to be planting hemp in 640 acres out of that section. It may be scattered fields throughout. So we have those small fields. And this, I apologize, there's a typo here. Whoops, sorry about that. This should be research areas. So Dana, you're going to be using that. You might need to correct that Monday. It should be research areas there. But the idea is that not only you're identifying this section, but you're identifying these individual fields that you're planting it as the research areas. And total acreage in 2019 for each license is capped at 80 acres. It's 320 for the next year, and unlimited, which means the full section could be planted the following year. The idea behind that, the advisory board actually voted on that issue, is to try to, we're concerned about the risk associated with it. And granted, you can obtain multiple licenses, but that takes multiple steps and resources to get to that point. We're very concerned about destroying fields of industrial hemp because we didn't realize that variety wasn't going to perform in Kansas. That's not a very good position for us to be in, but it very well could happen. So this actually starts detailing the next page, and again, this is all subject to change, but a table where you're talking about where you're at with the research sections and the individual research areas where you're wanting to plant. So as people call into us and ask, what can we do? What can we do to get ready? What can we do? Nothing's available because the regs aren't adopted. We talk about planning ahead. What are you going to do with your hemp? Where are you going to grow your hemp? Where are you going to obtain your seed? What is your research proposal going to look like? And we point them to all these resources we have on our website to give them an idea to start planning ahead because this isn't available to them yet. And again, we're working through the process of getting something like this ready to go so it can be sent out in January. But this ultimately is what they'll end up filling out. Greenhouses are okay. So you can have both outdoor and greenhouse locations in the same research section, and you would describe it as such. What that structure is, where it's located. GPS and coordinates are very important to us because we want to be able to come to that site if we needed to without having to have instructions from anybody else to get there. The other thing too is actually these sites are going to be published on our website. People who get licenses and where they're growing at are going to be published on the website. Not to mention there is also a requirement for each license to post in front of their field a sign saying this is industrial hemp and their license number and some other requirements too. The idea again from the advisory board's role is they want to be as open as possible to the public and to law enforcement of what's going on there so nobody thinks that there's some illicit activity going on. This is legal and they can do it legally. We do also talk about the idea of using transplants, stock plants, or in this case, but the idea is, I mentioned the clone idea, that was brought up in a previous presentation. That is an option, but we have to go back to the idea that the source of that stock came from certified seed at somewhere down the point that you can prove to us. And if you're just cloning that same plant and that's where your CBD production is fine, it's just you have to be able to document to us that it came from certified seed to be compliant with Senate Bill 263. Of course, it's the felony question there. If they say no, it still would pop up in their background check. That background check, there is a time restriction with that too. If you submit us an application to us today, you have 30 days for yourselves to submit your fingerprints and for us to get a background check from the KBI. They can turn that stuff around, but the idea is you're going to actually have to physically go down to the sheriff's office and get your fingerprints taken. The live scan, I don't know if anybody's familiar with it, but that doesn't work yet. But you're actually going to have fingerprint cards taken. You'll find part of this process will be is you'll get a waiver from our website that will go along with these fingerprints to the KBI to let them know that this is for industrial hemp, because all we get back from them is drug-related felonies. We don't get your whole rap sheet. We don't want your whole rap sheet. But that's all we want to know. And so that would be that requirement there. And this is actually 3 pages here of a bunch of acknowledgments. Now, I want to say these next pages may change because we've gone back and forth with our legal staff on what this is going to look like. We can have a bunch of acknowledgments here saying, you know, you're not going to grow hemp within such a distance of a school. Well, what if we state that a little bit wrong and not exactly what it says in the rules and regulations? Is that going to be a way for somebody to get out of a violation later on? So we may in fact have acknowledgments that try to put some of these regulations into layman's terms, or we may end up just referencing the regulations themselves and saying you read all these regulations and understand and will comply with them and make them sign the document there. That might be where we end up at. We're getting some different guidance from the Attorney General on what they would like to see, but this is really where it comes down to all the restrictions and the acknowledgments that come with the program. And I won't go through that too details. There's a lot of small print there, as you guys probably have seen from other applications. And then finally here is our attachment list of a copy of driver's license, application fee, maps, very important, research proposal, and then other documentations. And then here they sign it, they affirm, and that's their agreement that they're going to apply, and if they get a license, they're going to comply with all the rules and regulations that are set forth. This can be electronic. We don't have to have paper copies. It can work either way. So what's part 2? Part 2, I mentioned it in the previous page, part 2 is actually the research proposal. So at the top, you have your applicant name, what you're applying for, whether it's grower, distributor, processor, state educational institution. So the state educational institutions will have to submit this too. But these bullets are almost straight out of Senate Bill 263. But I think maybe it's some adjustments to it, but the idea is that here are some areas that could be researched. Because we had a discussion at the advisory board, or what priorities of research should there be out there? Should the advisory board promote some sort of, topics? Well, I guess Senate Bill 263, the legislature did that for us to some extent. But it's almost anything and everything, though. And so there's a lot of different things that can be studied. In rules and regs, we do spell out what a research proposal shall include, but it's included but not limited to, so we have adjustments on actually how we make this form look like. But we want it basic. It's not like something you guys in the university would submit where it'd be a, maybe 100-page proposal or more. It's a couple pages, briefly what you're wanting to do, your question, your objective, how are you going to measure, what data is going to be collected, your experimental design, how that project will be implemented, what data will be collected and analyzed, and how you're going to interpret that and what conclusions. Just some basic stuff using that document that we talked about earlier, the SARE document, SARE document, and guiding them. And they sign that and submit it. So how does this work internally for us? So we get an application packet submitted to us. I'm really doubtful we'll get completed applications perfectly the first time, so there probably will be an element of communication back and forth to that applicant to fill out things completely or legibly. If it's not, we can't understand it. But assuming something comes in completely, the department, we have an evaluation form the advisory board helped prepare for us that goes through the list of the statutory regulatory requirements KDA can say that people comply with or don't. So we check this off saying, no false statements, they have a completed application, they have all the maps, they pass the background check, all this stuff is good. If that's the case, then the second page of this and the research proposal gets forwarded to the advisory board for their consideration at that point. And this is, again, for growers, distributors, processors. The university would not take this step. The university is exempt from having to go through the approval of the advisory board. And then essentially this is an evaluation form that the board will use to help determine if that is good research and then they want to vote to approve it or vote against it. And so they would have this done ahead of time and then come to the board meeting, discuss it, and vote up or down. And if it's voted up, they get approved. I do want to point out these will be done blindly, right? So they will not know who's applying, who that is. And so that keeps a little bit of the concern of maybe conflict of interest out of the decision-making process at that point. So if it comes back, it's approved, we request the money, they submit the money, the check, and then the license is issued at that point. So really what this comes down to, this evaluation form, even though it talks about scoring, is really just a tool for the advisory board to use in determining if they're going to say yes or no to it. That was all put in place so that the Department of Ag does not become the arbitrator of what's good industrial hemp research or not. I do not want to be put in that position, so this board was established to help do that for us. So all that put together is the reason behind that is for compliance for Senate Bill 263 and beyond that, the 2014 Farm Bill. Mentioned earlier, just want to reiterate this. The educational institution doesn't have to go through that process. There's no fees imposed. But again, this is only university-only property is allowed. So there's some differences there. But an educational institution is essentially, depending on what you're applying to do, is good for all three aspects, whether you're growing, distributing, or processing, or maybe in the SEM case that was talked about, the idea of obtaining samples and processing them for disease levels or insect diagnostic purposes. This could fulfill that too. So that's it. That whole application, you can think of it mirrored for each different license type, except we're maybe asking a little bit different information on what they're doing with processing and distributing, et cetera. All right? Sounds good. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. So the floor is now open for follow-up questions from Jeff or for any of our prior speakers, Dr. Williams, Dr. Cranshaw. So we'll open it up. And maybe you can come on forward. Go ahead.
So it's harvested by hand, right? So do you have to have your harvesters go through all the background check and everything?
So the question is about harvesting by hand, and would the harvesters have to go through a background check and be identified? The answer is yes. If you have custom harvesters, you would have to identify them ahead of time and have them background checked and comply to be able in there to be harvested. If it's individuals that you have as hired labor to do that, the same thing would apply in that case. So planning ahead is very important. I understand the idea of maybe things change throughout the growing season. There is a method for changing things on the application, but there's a fee that's associated with doing that too. So we're trying to encourage. Kentucky was very upfront about this when they shared, the KDA shared their information on licensing in May 11th is they have a high modification fee. Is the intent is to discourage changes in the licensing, that people set where they're going to do things and how they're going to do it and stay with that plan, because it costs us and it costs us time to be able to change those things and get things approved for that step. But yes.
So what about a public-private collaborative research effort? So there's a couple of different things and nuances in between that. So if let's say a company like ours working with K-State, we each submit the application, correct? So it's two separate applications, but can there be one proposal, or do we each submit the same proposal of research within the application? How do you see that?
So the question is about if there was a public-private partnership, and how would that application process look like in that scenario? And in that case, if all the requirements of the state educational institution license can't be met, then it would default back to the grower's license. If it's something dealing with growing research, it would default back to that. So in this case, if it was your company and you were working with university professors or faculty to do that work, they would just be part of your application as individuals listed, and you would be the primary applicant.
But Jeff, you'd recommend it started as a university application, but then if it didn't meet those requirements, it would default. So if it was a collaborative project, but it met all the deals on the university side, could it live in there, or do we have to have a business application just because there's a business involved?
Well, it does, because of the idea of the university license only allows university faculty to be part of that. As soon as you involve other cooperators, whether they're farmers or businesses, then it defaults back to the grower's application in that case. Well, okay, let me clarify here. Dana reminded me about something. I do want to point that out. I keep referring to individuals, and no matter how we look at this, it's individuals or licensed. I know in some of our other licensed activities, it's a business, but the bill is very specific on licensing individuals. So if you own a company, the applicant is you as whoever is in your company is going to be the primary applicant, and we issue licenses to that person and not the business. In this case, Heartland would not get a license. It would be you. Yeah. Yes?
Jeff, just to clarify, on that license, anybody that's ever going to be in that field from planting to harvest needs to be listed. If I'm going to be going in there as a county agent or might need to go in there, I need to be in on the application to begin.
That's correct. That is our interpretation of how this will work out, is if you are going to be participating or involved in any way, as defined in the application, you would need to be listed as an individual and complete a background check prior to being licensed to be in that field.
So if you're using a local agribusiness like a co-op to apply some fertilizer, how do you do that? How do they know who's going to use it?
Well, I understand the question. The question is about if we were going to use a co-op or some sort of custom applicator to apply fertilizer or whatever may need to be applied. The way it should properly be done is those people should be identified ahead of time, that's the case. Granted, I understand the difficulty in doing that, and I'm not for sure exactly what kind of compliance we'll get in those situations, but those are the instructions we'll provide to people. Yeah?
So that would be true even before there's a crop in that space?
I would say no. identified that location and you have your license, but you still haven't planted industrial hemp there, that potentially could be outside of that.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, nobody can be added later?
The question is, can anybody be added later? You can add people later, but we do charge a modification fee to do that. There's a fee associated with modifying a license.
All right, Ernie, this is more towards you. So as an extension then, if somebody is growing this in our county and they want us to come and check it out because they have a corn earworm in it, we have to tell them no, and, right? We have to tell them no because we're not listed on that application.
Yeah, so we're figuring this out together. So, I gather if they're not on the permit, the answer is no, but the permit could be modified. But I had the same question about a public field day. Lucas, you have a comment?
But the cooperator could bring a plant sample to the edge of the field or to your office, right?
Is that legal in a courthouse?
Could the cooperator remove plant material from the field for the purpose of
So
insect identification?
they could, and as long as it stayed in their possession. Define that. Yeah, because they have their license. Right, exactly. And show it to you. I guess theoretically that would be still in compliant, but the idea of you handling it and moving it, that would be outside of
How do they
the.
dispose of those samples once they've had them tested for corn earworm, say, or identified for a disease?
Who would that be?
How do they like dispose of those samples once they're?
Being like extension or?
Well, the extension agent or the grower.
The question is about how disposing of samples. In this case, maybe we'll have to figure that out, but I know a lot of times what we talk about when we think about destroying is devitalizing the crop, making so it cannot reproduce or grow.
Since nobody's hand to I'm sorry, just real quick. My favorite example of that is an extension associate giving a talk, came to my farm, harvested a couple of fiber plants, which are like 3 meters tall, wouldn't fit in the car. What do you reckon he did? He drove down the road from out the window. Yeah, you think he would stop? Yeah. I'm sorry.
So Jeff, you said that the research objectives are well defined. What do you anticipate a grower is going to submit for a research proposal? What kind of research are they going to submit? I'm confused about this whole grow research thing. I mean,
Yeah,
growers and your license.
you're asking the question, what kind of research would be involved? A grower, hypothetically, this certainly, I'm not the advisory board, so I cannot make a determination. Carrie is a member of the advisory board currently, but we will certainly have a shifting of the membership. But as an example would be, I think would be easily, if somebody would be testing fertilizer rates or nitrogen rates, they could do something like that. What could a distributor do? Somebody who's selling seed, it could be an economic research type thing. Can they make money selling industrial hemp seed, or what kind of economic returns are there? Something down that line.
So if they just split their field with 2 different
Rates.
fertilizer rates, that would.
I mean, it theoretically would be there, yeah. It doesn't have to be. I know we're talking a little bit about the idea, what you guys do with randomized complete block designs and all this replication, different parts of the state, but that's not necessarily what the department or the advisory board is expecting through this process. It certainly could, but using some of the examples of on-farm research that's out there already is some of the model is what we're going to share for people going forward.
Will be required. I mean, they're going to have to do some comparison of some sort.
Most definitely. I expect that to be the case. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
follow up that, Jeff. So are they going to have statistical analysis that goes with this? I mean, if we're releasing a report that is labeled as research,
He's
see what you
Maybe
say.
there needs to be clarification, is it research or is it demonstration?
Because
Well,
It sounds like it's certain.
it has to be research by definition in the law. We can't deviate from that if this is what we're calling. And so this is why we're kind of, and I understand your guys' concern because we're kind of trying to connect the dots here legally to make it so that an individual who's not a Department of Ag employee or a university employee can grow industrial hemp and can handle it legally in the state. And so that is the conundrum we're in. I agree, but I think a lot of the concerns, and maybe Carrie, you can add to that.
We ask them for what data. Part of what their proposal has to be is part of their proposal will be what data do you intend to collect. So this is the kind of thing that Sarah is very familiar with. We award grants all the time to just real farmers and ranchers. And you do it's across the board. You know, is it as rigorous as what we do with K-State research? No, but they can also come up with some meaningful data. And that'll be one of the points that the review committee looks at. Are they going to collect, do they have a plan? I mean, are they just growing to grow because they think they're going to make a lot of money? And is that the data point that they have is how many dollars per acre? Or do they have a research point that, something data they're going to collect that's going to be meaningful to other producers? I guess does that make sense?
I guess I just am concerned about the term research because, many times we struggle really hard to impart upon producers what is unbiased research data and what is statistically valid information that we're giving to them. So I don't want, I think that's a very challenging thing. I don't think it's hard to define, but I think it's hard for some people to get straight in their minds.
The term is a challenge, and we have to go back to the Farm Bill and to the state statute now that says research only, but it also the statute very clearly says they want to include farmers in that. So we had to come up with some kind of a hybrid way of doing research that doesn't exclude the research that we all do, but in fact includes a lot of other collection of information.
I do want to point out too is that what we're requiring is a little bit more than what other states do. And I think that has been done at the guidance of the advisory board, of the leadership at the Department of Ag and the governor's office, and seeing what they really want to have. And guidance from the legislature, because there's 3 legislatures involved with the advisory board. But if you look at other states' applications, and I'm going to use Kentucky's as an example again, one of the ones we reviewed has one question in their application. It says in one sentence, describe what research you're going to conduct. All right, so there's different levels of trying to comply with that legal requirement, and we're a little bit more than that, but we certainly can't be to the point, based on where we're at with policy, get to the point where we're requiring people to do accurate, good design experiments with good statistics behind it. But I think certainly the advisory board will have a role in what they think is good and what they think is not good. And maybe if there's some opinions there as we go through that approval process will be certainly enlightening. Good. Yeah.
Yeah. So if we didn't have a grower, say, had a fruit crop, we really couldn't have a field day.
There is.
Because the public really can't handle it.
So the question is about field days and allowing those. And so currently the restrictions do not allow access for the public, but there is a process for people to request the ability to conduct field days through a request to the Department of Ag at no cost, but you're just letting us know what you're doing and when you're doing it. So there is a possibility of having that.
This next question could sound self-serving, but and maybe Marty is the only other one in the audience that would be interested. But I'm curious: the Kentucky or Colorado Agricultural Experiment Station invested dollars directly into hemp research?
No, not in Kentucky.
Not in Kentucky. We have full administrative support for our efforts. So I'm the director of the substation in eastern Kentucky. So at that level, I invest some in-kind support, right? So our staff and our facility, our infrastructure, but we have no financial support.
So your staff salaries and so on as in-kind contributions to the research is what you're saying? Yeah.
Yes.
Our agricultural experiment station does support to some degree. There are plots of hemp at most of the experiment stations around the state. Now, half of them are ones that the Department of Ag plants, because again, I said the Department of Ag plants new varieties all over the state in order to make sure they don't go hot, don't go above 0.3% THC, so that then they can be certified. So there are those at every experiment station. That's not paid for by CSU, it'd be paid for by Department of Ag. But there's a funded project on irrigation, there's a funded project on some genetics. I get a little money to look at insects, but that's under a kind of, anyway. But
Yeah,
yes,
so
there is some support.
Those are state funds.
Those are state, our ag experiment station does support a small amount, very modest.
Just one little nuance. Do you all know if you've received any federal hatch funds to?
No, I have received money from the Western Region IPM program, which is a USDA-funded program.
Yeah.
So I got $25,000 from them 2 years ago. The year before, they said, no, we can't do hemp. But then the next year, they said, yes, we could, and we'd like to. A modest amount. That's the only federal funds I've ever gotten directly.
Dean, just about 2 months ago, we received approval from NIFA for an NINSS multi-state project.
Yeah.
So that's clearly not exactly the same thing.
No, I'm familiar with that one.
Good,
yeah. So
we'll have funding for travel to the annual meeting for that project, but no funding for on-station work.
How many of those varieties in both states have been above that acceptable percentage level? Has a lot of them thrown out or not, I guess?
I don't know specifics in Colorado. I was just reading their report from last year. It was, they looked at, I think, like 6 varieties, and 4 of them they were going to allow to go ahead with being a certified seed line. I don't know how many get kicked out.
I don't know the specific number in Kentucky either, but there's a list of varieties available on the other KDA website, and there have been several that have become prohibited varieties. Whitney, no offense, almost all of them from Colorado.
To follow up on that with Kansas, we do have adopted by reference a list of approved varieties. We do not have a prohibited list, and that list has started with information from other states on varieties that have been good so far. There is an exception that is allowed if a researcher, whether it's a grower or the university, wants to grow something that's not on the list, because of course it's not perfect because it's our first shot at it. We can grant those exceptions too if they provide the information to us on justifying that. So we're trying to build a similar list in the state so that it's not a guarantee it's going to work, not be hot in Kansas, but it's a starting point, and so that we're prohibiting some of the ones that are already known to be test high in other states.
In response to your question, I mean, part of the reason the ones went hot from Colorado is that because they're trying to develop new varieties in North America. You're using all these European ones, but they know what those work like.
Right.
Yeah. So all the new varieties are being developed here in North America for a lot of Colorado people. And there's several private. There's been a lot of money. There's several companies that they've got their own breeding programs. They've got their own lines. They're not yet to certified seed yet, but there's a lot of money has gone in to develop new varieties for this crop. The university's not part of that at all. Well, some anyway. Yes,
Stu. Go ahead.
Somebody asked this earlier and I missed it. Have you guys had research in your states that are there practices, environmental things that will cause these things to go hotter?
We haven't done specific research to quantify that effect, but it's very well known, and some even in the refereed literature, that plant stress, will increase cannabinoid levels. So drought stress, pest stress, and some other stresses will cause cannabinoid levels to increase. How much? I couldn't even begin to guess, but it's been our experience that it's always genetics first. Will define cannabinoid levels, and then stress can have a secondary, more minor effect. Would you agree?
Yes, and a lot of people want to know the specifics on what stress would work. But again, how Colorado Department of Ag is doing, they just grow it in lots of very different places. And see if it can, I mean, to grow it in the San Luis Valley at 7,500 feet is way different than growing it in the Arkansas Valley Research Center in Rocky Ford. Where it's very hot. And anyway, so, but that's a good question. I've always wondered about defoliation and hail. I mean, is that going to make it go hot or less hot? Who knows? People don't really know why these plants even make these compounds.
They're thought to be plant protective compounds, but that hasn't been fully delineated yet. But we had one certified seed crop field that tested twice, essentially the same protocol, above 0.4, and that same variety in other fields by the same producer passed. So it's clearly not only genetics, but again, we're talking about a tiny, tiny percentage. We're not talking about really major contributions from stress, but it's enough to matter. So they lost that seed. I think it was about 80 acres or something of seed that went down the tubes.
Lucas?
Jeff, I don't know, if the IT guys will let you fly the computer, it might be worthwhile pulling up the KDA Hemp website just to show everyone what resources are available on there. I think, because I think for our local agents, as they got people coming through the door, this is, you want to be able to hand something off to them, they can go home with something in their hands. KDA has done an exceptional job of laying this out in an easy to use format.
Well, I'm not getting a response for some reason.
How is the availability of
Question is, what is the availability of certified seed? The European Union and AOSTA and the Canadian equivalent, I can't remember either acronym from Canada or the EU, but they all have reciprocal agreements. So seed that's certified in Canada and in the EU enjoys the same protection in the United States. And I don't know if Kansas is following that same line of thinking, but certified seed from any of those entities in Kentucky is acceptable. So, we can import seed from other countries that's certified.
purchase seed shortages?
I'm sorry?
Is there purchase seed shortages?
I think demand exceeds supply. Yeah, so it's best to get in line early. And of course, that clearly has an impact on the price. So it's way, way more expensive than a normal economic model will support long term.
And yeah, we're planning on following a similar idea. We identify KCI as the certification organization, and they follow the standards that they follow in the same field. So
There have been problems about getting seed also on time the last few years. I mean, people who get it, often it doesn't, approvals don't come through until June, and they should be planting it in April or May. But there's been a delay in getting that whole aspect.
Giant advantage in Kentucky is that the KDA manages all of that. So there's a single point of contact with the US EPA. We don't have hundreds of DEA licensed individuals in Kentucky, which muddles up that process horribly. So the KDA will send in, they'll copy you when they submit that application to the DEA. That'll happen a day or two after you submit to them. So it's not the KDA's fault if it doesn't come through. But I think more often than not, it's the fact that the Europeans really don't care if the seed gets here on time or not.
That could be.
That's about as much an issue.
Because we're competitors now, right?
To follow up on Lucas' request here, here's our website, our industrial hemp page. It's agriculture.ks.gov/industrial hemp is the shortcut to type into the address if you want to get there. Up top, we have our current draft of regulations that are going through the approval process, the EIS, the approved varieties list. We have essentially the same presentation I gave today is also linked in here. And then some background on the program information, how it became about, some facts, frequently asked questions, the advisory board who's a part of that. And then quite a bit of information here from our May 11th meeting, that open dialogue and information exchange with presentations from both Kentucky and Colorado's program. Our overview, which is kind of a little bit outdated, but that's essentially similar to what we're following through. And then if you're really wanting to know what was discussed there and have a lot of time to read, there's a full transcript of that entire meeting there too.
Jeff, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Is there going to be a main link to this on your main page? Because it looks like to me it's pretty deep buried on your page. I mean, on your main website.
Currently there's not, but I think potentially I can ask and see what Heather might do or Jason might do for us. But we've been always pointing people to the shortcut, the agriculture.ks.gov/industrial hemp will take you to this page. But yes, it's buried in our program. It's one of our program pages. It's certainly not directly linked up front, but I'll take that and see what we can do.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, Dr. Crenshaw mentioned, the companies involved in raising the seed. What are some of the companies involved? Are any of them some of the big players? I'm just curious. Companies that are...
No, I don't think so. They're just companies interested in developing hemp. Got some venture capital and
just kind of startup type.
Yeah, they do their own growing, they do their own processing, they do their own breeding. Yeah.
No big names we recognize?
No, not yet. I mean, assume when somebody's successful, somebody will buy them up, but I think the big players are waiting.
So, did I misunderstand earlier? You suggested that most of the hemp production in Colorado was transplants from clones?
Yeah, because it's CBD. Most all CBD is still...
Yeah, nationwide. So we're talking about this certified seed. I guess that's just a canvas to get started, or?
Right, and so what we're interpreting this as is if you're doing clones, some sort of asexual reproduction like that, and the source of that genetic came from certified seed, and you can prove that, it's allowable.
Which is going to be difficult, I think.
It could
there's
be,
not
yeah.
much certified seed within that space, I don't believe.
Not yet, no.
Yeah.
No, there's no high CBD ones that are certified.
That's going to be difficult to do. But there are some varieties that are 5% or so, so a significant percentage of CBD that are readily available, dioecious, so you could plant those from certified seed, select for females, and then move forward with that model. But it's not going to be competitive with many of the lines from Colorado that are 20% CBD, but it's a place to start. Yeah.
I think certainly to follow up with that has certainly been a limitation that we've discussed several times in the advisory board. So I would assume if any sort of legislation is going through the legislature this year on industrial hemp, that might be an issue that's dealt with, because not only are we dealing with this issue, we're dealing with just general variety development problems too, because we can't do from certified seed.
I have another question, and I'll show my ignorance here. When you plant a clone, does it maintain the same gender?
Yeah, well, it's an all-female plant. You're cloning from an all-female plant, and state, yeah, they
So
state.
that's another advantage in transplanting a clone.
Right.
You got all female.
Right. Yeah.
One thing I think we haven't really touched on in this session is water use. We talked about soil remediation yesterday. Can you just give us a quick overview on some of that we talked about yesterday?
Right, yeah, so Kentucky is not the place, Kentucky's not the place to evaluate water use efficiency. 58 inches of rain this year, so we have no shortage of soil moisture. I can't wait till Lucas gets some work started at his station on exactly that. So I probably Colorado would have.
Well, I mean, one thing I'm not sure about if it's been resolved, and maybe it has, but there have been prohibitions of
using water if the water is from a federal water project. So if you irrigate from a federal water project, that's still been up in the air. And so, so people in the Arkansas Valley won't, many of them have got federal water, so they've got to use well water or some other source. Yeah, that I hope gets figured out in this next farm bill.
I mean, he's an abject
So like, so everything down at Rocky Ford, none of that's coming off the ditch, that's all groundwater? To keep it?
Some of the guys are using some of the guys are using groundwater for it. Yeah, and it may have been resolved. I mean, this is something I heard 2 years ago, and they've talked to their reps and everything. But it is still a question. I don't know how it got resolved, but that was. I mean, everything was so touchy the first couple of years. You couldn't have any federal involvement in its production. So anyway, I'm not. That needs to be figured out. It was mentioned to me. I don't know if it's been resolved better.
So what's your perception? So most of this in Colorado that I've seen, I mean, it's all space planted, it's being grown more horticulturally, correct?
Yeah.
What is your perception in terms of water use versus like those guys down at Rocky Ford versus melons or some of their other crops? Is it equally as intensive from a water use standpoint, or what's kind of your gut feel there?
It clearly uses water. The only irrigation study that I'm aware of was done on varieties up near Fort Collins at the experiment station, and there were pretty big differences in growth depending on how much water they got. And the more water you gave them, the bigger they grew. But I don't know how much, if they're using more or not. The best field I ever saw was one growing this year. There was a melon field last year. The weirdest weeds I've ever seen are melons were either weeds, but from the volunteers. But yeah, it was drip irrigated. They used the same drip system they'd used the previous year and grew enormous, really good looking plants.
I would suppose that a pure supposition, you'll see yield responses similar to corn.
Just one other pest thing that I'd like to bring up that wasn't mentioned since you might get samples, but we haven't talked about plant diseases. There are some foliar diseases of this crop, and they can be really serious if you are in a humid area. There's also, I think, big varietal differences too that sometime will get figured out. But and that's a problem for handling this as a diagnostician. For insect samples, I can get a lot of them as pictures, and I can identify them, or they can send me it in alcohol without sending any plant material. But plant disease samples, you've got to take it to the clinic. Somebody's got to get it to the clinic because there's a lot of foliar pathogens in particular.
Yeah. So I'll just note very, very quickly that Whitney's exactly right. We've seen crop failures, whole failures due to fungal disease issues, but with no exceptions that I'm aware of, they're all in clonal production systems. So yeah, big biology news flash, you plant genetically identical, individuals. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And so it didn't take very long for a couple of pathogens to figure that out. We've never had any issues in seed-derived crops. Now we have some fungal, especially some early saprophytic stuff very close to harvest, but we have no yield impact at all in seed-derived crops, only clonal production systems.
Go ahead.
Have there been any, or do you have any kind of figures as far as what it's gonna cost per acre to grow this stuff?
So that's the $10,000 question. The transplants range from $3 to $5 a piece and are planted for anywhere from 1,000 to 5,000 plants per acre. So huge amount of, and that's not even counting the human input to that model to produce all those plants. So, that production model is, I don't think, long-term. Seed these days ranges from $6 to $12 a pound, so a great deal of variation within that. We mentioned that, that can't last. That's not economically viable. It needs to be at $2 or below for farmers to be profitable on a broad acre basis. So it's not economically on level ground yet. So it's very high cost. Today it's very expensive.
right, well, it looks like we've gotten the questions answered. We really do appreciate everyone who's contributed to this session from the planning perspective and then today as well. So let's give everyone a nice round of applause. Thank you so much.